With its markets, docks and wealthy citizens, London's always been home to a large criminal underclass. And over the centuries, the authorities have tried all sorts of ways to hold back the tide of crime. Here is one of London's most famous landmarks and its most infamous prison, the Tower of London. The Tower wasn't actually built as a prison to keep Londoners in, but as a fortress to keep them out. The first structure, the White Tower, was built by William the Conqueror to demonstrate his power and to intimidate the notoriously unruly Saxon Londoners. They would never have seen such a massive building. At 90 feet high and 118 feet wide, with walls 13 feet thick, it was at the time the second largest Norman tower in the world. Even though the tower wasn't built as a prison, people have been locked up here for more than 800 years. From the 12th century to the 1820s, the Tower was the UK's principal state prison for religious and political prisoners. This is Traitor's Gate, which was the way that many prisoners were brought into the Tower. Just imagine how scary it must have been. Brought down the river in a boat, and then the great tower looms up in front of you, and you know what's going to happen to you. For many prisoners, the Tower was London's death row. Some were held for years before their executions on Tower Hill, attended by thousands of eager spectators. The Tower was used again briefly as a high-security state prison during both World Wars to hold enemy agents, the most famous of them being Rudolf Hess. But the Tower wasn't always so secure. The first prisoner of all, in the year 1100, was a chap called Ranulph Flambard, who was Bishop of Durham, and they put him in the White Tower here for extortion. But he was a wily bird and he managed to escape. What he did was to throw a banquet for his guards, saying they were wonderful chaps, and when they were all drunk and asleep, he escaped down a rope that had been hidden in the wine casket, and down here were all his friends with horses, and they galloped off to France. Well, I guess they had to swim the last bit, but anyway, they escaped. Contrary to legend, the Tower has never had a large prison dungeon filled with manacled inmates. In fact, most prisoners were kept in one of the smaller towers along the inner and outer curtain walls. They were held in varying degrees of comfort, depending on the status of the crime and of the prisoner. The celebrated courtier and explorer Sir Walter Raleigh spent 13 years in the Tower, condemned to death for allegedly plotting against James I. This does not look like a prison cell, but as an aristocratic prisoner, Raleigh spent his longest stay at the Tower in this very room. He also had space for 3 servants. His wife and his eldest son came to visit him here, and his younger son was actually born in the Tower. He was allowed a lot of freedom of movement. He used to grow tobacco and other exotic plants on the lawn outside, and he did scientific experiments in a converted hen shed. He also did a lot of reading and a lot of writing. He wrote his biggest book in this very room. For other prisoners, life wasn't quite as comfortable, but the Tower's fearsome reputation was surpassed by the horrors awaiting prisoners in jails for common criminals. When I think of medieval prisons, I think of rat-infested dungeons. And one notorious prison in Southwark, the Clink, was exactly like that. Built on the south side of the Thames, in an area full of theatres and brothels, for 700 years, the Clink was a place of terror for heretics, debtors and criminals arrested in the nearby streets. Up until the 19th century, prisoners had to pay for their own food and lodging, so those in the Clink starved in sickening filth. And along with these ghastly conditions, prisoners were also subjected to horrific punishments. We talk these days about people being pilloried, which means ridiculed. Well, this is the pillory. It used to stand just outside the Clink, and it was used for minor offences. I'm stood on tiptoe and I can't move my head or my hands much. Well, it's a bit uncomfortable, but the fact is you are being exposed and ridiculed in front of the whole of London walking past. And what's more, people would chuck things at you. Rotten eggs, rats, dead cats. and sometimes stones. In fact, people even died in the pillory. Even if you weren't undergoing any of those horrible punishments, life in here was pretty unpleasant, partly because you were chained up all the time. On the hands you'd have manacles or handcuffs like this, and on your legs or feet you'd have these fetters, which are very, very heavy, great heavy chain. So even if you escaped, you wouldn't be able to run very much. And the noise in here must have been horrible. Screams from the whipping post or the pillory. And then for people wandering around, clank, clank, clank. In fact, it probably got its name, the clink, from this very clinking noise, which must have been absolutely continuous. And indeed, it became a generic name for all prisons, the clink. Locking people up in prisons depended on locks. And here is the original lock from Newham Jail. It's partly sprung like that, but it's also a deadlock because you can turn it like that. Isn't that a lovely noise? Let me show you round the back, and you'll see that there's a great clunking steel bolt here, which is going to prevent people from opening the door. And there's this very interesting key. It's a Brammer lock, invented by Joseph Brammer, who came from Yorkshire and started making these down here. And you'll see the key is actually like a cylinder with a lot of slots in it. And to open the lock, you have to push it in and push it against a spring and then turn it. And these locks were practically unpickable. Let me just show you how they worked. Here is my model Brammer lock. And I've straightened out that cylindrical key. So the key now, instead of having those slots round in a circle, actually has tines sticking up. But you see each one to a different extent. Now, let me show you the principle of the Brammer lock. Here is the bolt, which is holding the door shut, and it won't open because there are pins on the bolt which are running into these sliders. These are the sliders here. And what I need to do is to lift up each of those sliders to a different extent so those pins will go through the slots in the sliders. So I put the key into the lock and I turn it, and that's lifting these three sliders up differently until when I get there they're all neatly lined up and the bolt will then slide smoothly across. It's very, very clever, and it's because those slots are hidden way inside the mechanism that you can't see how to pick it. Conditions in the prisons were terrible, but at least the inmates were still alive. By the 18th century, there were over 200 crimes for which you could be hanged. Some were as petty as theft of a handkerchief. At Tyburn, the site of London's most notorious gallows, over 50,000 people were executed. I'm now apparently following the path of condemned men on their way from Newgate Prison to the gallows, and Lucy Moore, who's a historian, knows all about what actually happened. Lucy, we seem to be headed for Oxford Street, is that right?
We are heading to Oxford Street. In the 18th century, these would have been open fields, so we would have been riding through countryside.
Really? Just here?
Absolutely.
Oh, fantastic.
All the way along this road. Basically, the condemned men and women sometimes were taken from Newgate Prison to Tyburn, which is modern Marble Arch,
really?
where they were hanged. People would line the streets, and depending on whether the criminal was a sort of villain or a hero, people would either pelt them with stones and rotten fruit and things like that, or else girls dressed in white would throw bouquets into the cart for them.
Really?
It was a sort of hero worship thing. They were the celebrities of their day. The highwaymen, you know, were terribly handsome and dashing, the gentlemen of the road. 3/4 of the people who were killed at Tyburn were men between 20 and 30, so there was a sort of men cut down in their prime. I think that was what the sort of celebration aspect of it was about, was a way of sending them off. And so people would offer to buy them drinks all the way along, and they had the right to stop for a drink on the way. One for the road, that's where that comes from, and I think falling off the wagon.
And so what did they drink?
You would have had a pint of sack.
A pint of sack. Look, driver, could you stop at the next pub? I'll have a pint of sack. There were hangings at Tyburn for 600 years from the 12th century onwards. In the 16th century, in an attempt to speed things up, a new type of gallows was introduced, the Tyburn Tree. And they call it the Tyburn Tree, but it wasn't really a tree, was it?
No, basically there was a triangular structure so that they could have 3 layers of people hanging. They had a cart underneath each of the sort of horizontal bars, and they would be, the condemned men and women would be stood on the back of the cart with their the noose around the neck, and the horses would be whipped, and the cart would drive off, and they would swing out. So from the beginning, you died of asphyxiation rather than your neck breaking. So it was a horrible, horrible death. They used to say you died of a sore neck and a wet pair of breeches. There's all sorts of nasty stuff going on. And criminals' friends might come up and try and tug on the legs to make the death more quick and therefore more painless. There's an instance of somebody who, after 15 minutes of hanging, was cut down and was still alive. He was known as Half-Hanged Smith. And he survived to live on afterwards. They let him off.
Oh, did they?
Yeah.
Oh, that was good. Were the crowds there?
Absolutely. There was sort of, well, sometimes people say there are 100,000 people there, but normally kind of 30,000.
Wow.
And there were special grandstands built. There were, which people could buy tickets for. There were...
like a football match?
Absolutely like a football match. People used to hire the top rooms of taverns so that they could get good views.
Well, we seem to be getting close now. I guess my time may have come. Well, it's been very nice knowing you, Lucy. Will you pull on my feet, please?
Yes, I certainly will.
Like any great city, London has its fair share of crime. And to cope with that, it needs a system of justice. You might find it hard to believe, but just a few yards away from noisy, bustling Fleet Street, there's a place full of peace, tranquility, and lawyers. This is Middle Temple, one of 4 ancient societies of lawyers in London known as the Inns of Court. The inns were founded way back in the Middle Ages. In the 12th century, Henry II, faced with increasing feudal violence, sent his court around the country to settle disputes. Monks and priests were employed as scribes, as they were almost the only people who could read and write. Their advice was often asked for, and they were, in effect, the first lawyers. When the court resettled in London, the lawyers took up residence in the Inns of Court, and today this is where students train to become barristers. Judges and barristers are instantly recognisable by their wigs and gowns, so I've come to a chap who actually supplies them. Trevor, could you dress me up as a barrister?
Without a problem.
Right.
All I need is measurements.
All right, 46 chest?
No, I don't even need that. All I want to know is how it drops at the back. Fits on the bottom of your calf, right under there, 50. And if I can just check your head size.
Very fat is the answer to my head. Swollen, some would say.
Right, 62 centimetres.
62 the head.
62, and we drop at a 50. You'd
Right,
just like
so
to slide your arms in.
Arm in there, arm in there.
You'll find it just sits there like that.
That's very comfortable.
No buttons.
And the wig is 62. What's it made of?
This one's made of horsehair. Come from Australia.
Why do they wear wigs?
When Charles II came back from France, he came back, and wigs were very fashionable in France. And so the whole court would have adopted wigs, because they would all have wished to have been the same. And when you're like me and you're going slightly thin, it definitely adds something.
And is there anything special about the gown?
Yes, there is. On the back, which you may not have noticed, is current to all gowns, is a pocket. It looks like a little fish.
Right.
And in the bottom of it is stitched a little tiny piece there.
Right.
All the money would have been in coinage. And when you'd finished making your opinions, I, as a client, would wish to pay you. So I would pay you, and I'd put the money into the slip.
Ah, so I never had to put my hands out.
Well, correct. And we think that's where our backhander came from.
Oh, what a wonderful story. And that's brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. I'm not sure my learned friends would agree with that story, but now I'm dressed for the part, I'll pay a visit to the most important courts in the land, the Royal Courts of Justice. The Royal Courts are home to the High Court and the Court of Appeal, which hears both civil and criminal cases. This is one of London's great Victorian buildings and was opened in 1882. It was the largest public building project since the Houses of Parliament, and its architect was George Edmund Street. Street had won a competition to design the building, and as this sole architect and a stickler for detail, he was responsible for every single thing, from the foundations to the spires, from the carved pillars to the intricate mosaic floors. It exhausted him building this place, and in fact he died before it was finished. Parliament bought a 7.5-acre site for the new courts, and they had to clear 450 houses just to make space for the new building, which gives you some idea of how big it is. The building is so enormous that an incredible 3 miles of corridors are needed to connect the original 18 courts. I'm in the dock of court number 4, the court of the Lord Chief Justice. Street actually asked a variety of architects to design all the courts slightly differently, so they have different sorts of carvings and different sorts of canopies and so on. Here we have a fabulous carving of the coat of arms, which comes from the original Court of Justice in Westminster Hall. And this is where the judge sits, high above the rest of the court. The Victorians loved their pecking order. And the court itself is immensely high. Just look at that roof. The royal courts are renowned for the beautifully detailed stonework, but there's one section that wasn't part of Street's plan. During the construction, the British stonemasons went on strike. So Street had to draft in a whole lot of foreigners to get on with the job. This led to some rather curious results. If you see here is a nice double pillar, smooth and elegant and with no features on it. But those foreigners met with terrible hostility, so much so they had to be housed and fed within the building. And they had to do something to while away their time, so they got on with the work, which they loved. And they began carving beautiful patterns into the pillars. Look at this. Isn't that wonderful? Until Street found out and said, hey, that's not in the plan, stop at once. The Royal Courts of Justice took 8 years to complete and remain a suitably impressive testament to centuries of law and order. When the Royal Courts were built, London had been enduring increasing levels of crime and had to deal with more offenders than ever before. Australia would no longer take our convicts, so Britain had to embark on a massive prison building project. One of those new prisons is behind me. Built in 1851, it was originally called the Surrey House of Correction and had 700 prisoners in individual cells. It's now HMP Wandsworth. It has more than 1,400 prisoners. It's the largest prison in London and one of the biggest in Western Europe. Many Victorian prisons were based on the panopticon design, which meant prisoners could be observed at all times. Wandsworth has 2 buildings with radiating wings from a central tower. Inside the wings are open galleried landings, which enable the prison to be run on the separate system. I'm now inside Wandsworth Prison, in fact, in the smaller of the 2 buildings, which was originally the women's prison. And the architecture is very obvious. There are 3 wings here, and you can see all the way down all of them from the central point. And the chap who really knows about Wandsworth is Stuart McLaughlin, who is a historian and a prison officer. Is that right?
That's right, Adam.
Fantastic. Tell me about the separate system. What is it?
The separate system was something that Britain inherited from America, largely from the Haviland State Penitentiary in Philadelphia, where it was deemed that the best way to rehabilitate people was to keep criminals isolated from each other and have a purpose-built building for that effect. There were some theories in the 19th century that crime was a disease that could be caught as easily as
mumps,
typhoid, cholera, you name it. So if you isolated each individual person, then there's less chance of contamination.
So to keep all the prisoners separate then, always in solitary confinement, yes?
Always in solitary confinement, 1 prisoner per cell only.
Right. And communication?
Would simply be no talking whatsoever. It was silent and separate. So no communicating. Even the warders at the time couldn't communicate with prisoners beyond simple instructions to get the job done. And the isolation system also got to the level that complete lack of identity for the prisoner beyond their prison number.
How?
So they would wear their prison uniform, and then on leaving a cell, they would have to wear a mask.
Really?
They would have to cover their faces, and that included female prisoners who were required to wear a veil.
Were they sentenced to hard labour? I mean, did they crack rocks?
In the London prisons, hard labour in terms of rock breaking couldn't take place. We've got no stone quarries.
Right.
So, again, Victorian ingenuity came up with the hard labour machine, which was a large box with a series of gears connected to a hand crank, which meant that the prisoner, if sentenced to hard labour, which was a court sentence, would have to turn so many revolutions on the hand crank machine.
So it was just a handle?
It was a handle, and it also had a counter which showed so many revolutions that you were meant to do by lunchtime and by supper time. The hard labour machine could have resistance on the gears, easier or harder, depending on the stature or the age of the prisoner. So that would be the job of the warder to turn a screw, and that's where the term screw comes from.
Oh, I see. And it didn't do anything, this cranking?
It was a totally valueless machine, other than that the prisoner built up a sweat and got tired through its use.
Right. I'm inside one of the cells at Wandsworth now. One of the sorts of hard labour that prisoners had to do here, and indeed all over the country, was picking oakum. And they'd get a bit of tarry old rope from the Navy, and first they'd untangle the main strands like this, and then they'd take one of those strands and pull all the smaller strands apart, and then they would actually pull the fibres out from the strands. Now, this bit of rope isn't very old and it isn't very tarry, but you can imagine that with a very old tarry bit, this would be extremely hard work. In fact, it's quite hard work on my skin now. And once they'd separated all the fibres, they could then take the loose fibres and use them to stuff mattresses, or indeed, mixed with more tar, to stuff into the holes in ships. And when they sold this stuff, they really were getting money for old rope. Now, I better pick a bit more or I won't get any lunch. Wandsworth Prison is slightly reminiscent of the Tower of London, which used to loom intimidatingly above the medieval city, keeping people on the right side of the law. This grim building reminds us all today that in the end, crime doesn't pay.